You know, Jesus said that he came to the Jews, lost sheep of the house of Israel. Sometimes we forget that about Jesus, that Jesus was a Jewish Messiah, wasn't he? He came to the Jewish nation to save the Jews, who rejected him ultimately for the most part, but nevertheless, that was his mission. So it's kind of unique in this case where the Gentile comes to him. And we don't know. This could have been Greek. It could have been a Greek. Hard to say. He goes to the region of Tyre. Matthew says Tyre and Sidon. He'd entered a house. He wanted no one to know it, yet he could not escape, right? Everybody knows now. He can't get away from him. And after hearing of him, a woman, his little daughter, had an unclean spirit, immediately came and fell at his feet. In Matthew, it says she was a Canaanite woman from the region. Have mercy on me. My daughter is truly demon-possessed. But he did not answer her a word. And they said, send her away, because she keeps shouting at us. And he answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. You know, that's kind of an interesting, we hear of Jesus healing all these people, right? Multitudes of people coming to him, even touching his cloak, to be healed. And yet, uniquely, this is a Jewish deal, isn't it? And we kind of lose sight of that sometimes when we read the Gospels. Jesus was in a very Jewish region, Judea, Galilee. Went through Samaria, but even that was kind of half-blood Jews, right? But Jesus was uniquely in this realm of Judaism. And yet here this Canaanite woman comes to him and says, my daughter has an unclean spirit. And Jesus doesn't even answer her, doesn't even respond at all. No response. His disciples said, send her away. Those guys are going to wind up having to go to the Gentiles. And yet here, look at how biased they are against them, right? A lot of prejudice here, isn't there? We talk about prejudice today. Prejudice was rampant in the days of Jesus. Everybody seemed not to like anybody else. Jesus could be accused easily here of being prejudiced, couldn't he, against the Gentiles or against this Canaanite woman. But Jesus' mission was to Israel. And that's what he said. I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus was staying on his mission, his task, what he was oriented, what he was sent to do, was to go to them. If he had turned to the Gentiles at this particular point, if he had started to heal the Gentiles or deal with the Gentiles, how would that have affected his ministry with the Jews, right? He was already on wobbly ground with the Jews, right? If he would have went towards the Gentiles, what would the Jews have thought of him then? Would they have thought he was the Messiah at all if he would have done that at this point in history? No, they would have absolutely rejected him, right? No way that you can go to those unclean. They're unclean. There's no way you can go to them. Jesus alluded to the Gentiles. There's other people of this fold who I'm going to bring into the fold. There's others who I'll bring into the fold, right? There's vines that's going to be grafted onto the branches, or branches that are be grafted onto the vines, right? So he alluded a lot to the idea of this going to the Gentiles. But the truth is that during the Jesus ministry, it didn't go to the Gentiles. Matter of fact, how long would it be? 1,000-point question, right? How long would it be before the gospel actually was preached to the Gentiles? Household of Cornelius, Acts chapter 11. How many years was that before Peter actually went and preached to the Gentiles? Household of Cornelius. About 10 years. Yeah, so it was going to be about 10 years after Jesus was crucified. After Jesus was crucified, it's going to be about 10 years before the gospel would actually go to the Gentiles. So, we're a long ways from the Gentiles being brought into this fold at this particular point.
This passage has always been hard for me to take.
Why is that? Because he just didn't pay attention, or you think it's uncompassionate, or? Well, why did Jesus come to earth? To heal the sick?
No, he came to save us all.
Yeah.
That's what he came to do. You don't know what I mean at all.
Oh, I know.
Okay, so, at that time, in Jesus' sight, even
It is. It's a tough passage.
In a way, actually, God had kind of trained him to be prejudiced. In our day and age, it's like prejudice is terrible. But back then, they were told, go in and kill all of these people. These others are not of our group are unclean. So why would the Jews at this point not think terrible of the others because they haven't been taught yet?
Right. Yeah, prejudice. They were very prejudiced. They were God's people. They were God's chosen. And anybody else that wasn't God's chosen weren't worthy. I mean, they weren't. Just back to life. Now, I'm not going to say that's right or wrong, but you're right. That is their training. That is their upbringing. That is exactly their view of life and their view of the world. And Jesus was mission oriented. Jesus was mission oriented. Jesus knew his mission, what he was supposed to do, and he knew how this could hinder that mission. He was already being criticized for the Samaritan. John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman was half blood, right? He already was under criticism for that. He's already under criticism for eating with tax collectors and sinners, who were Jews, but yet tax collectors and sinners, right? Uh-huh. Right. But Jesus was, he said right here, I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I mean, that was his mission at this particular time. She began to bow down, saying, Lord, help me. And I really like what she said. I think there's just Old Testament implications in what she said. She said, he answered and said, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, like Brent says, very derogatory, right? Basically calling the Gentiles dogs, the children's bread, the children being the Jews, and throw it to the dogs. But she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And I think that's really interesting because Jesus really kind of used that same analogy when he talked about the rich man and Lazarus, right? Lazarus was fed basically from the crumbs, right, that fell, right, that he was out there with the dogs. And I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel in a sense, although I've never really researched it. It says, woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. Mark said, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left, Mark says. So, Jesus performed the miracle. Why? Because she implored him to do it, even though he probably was not wanting to do that necessarily. He thought it could hurt his ministry. It was an exception. That's why we have it in the Gospels. It was an exception to what Jesus did, but yet Jesus still had compassion on her because she sought him out. And I think there's great truth in that for us. It was probably hard for her to go and approach him, being a Gentile, I would think, in a predominantly Jewish setting. Right, and she was right, and she was yeah, and she was wise, right, like Brent said, she was a smart woman. Even we get the crumbs. I'll even take the crumbs, right? Yeah, yeah, it really speaks a lot about where Jesus was and where his disciples were and apostles were at this particular point in his ministry. And yet this is going to change. Jesus is all about change. God's all about change. And this too is going to change. Jesus then went to the Sea of Galilee. He travels a lot, doesn't he? Why, do you think? Why didn't he just stay in one place and have everybody just come to him? In the Gospels, over and over, we see he's going, he's moving, he's on the sea, he's walking, he's traveling continually, isn't he? Yet people are coming to him too, right? People are coming great distances to find him, to see him. And wouldn't it have been easier if he had just stayed in one spot and said, here I am, everybody come to me, instead of traveling around everywhere like he did? Why do you think that was important to him, to travel so much, to move so much? There you go. You know, Jesus was so focused on the people that everybody overlooked, the poor and the disabled and the people that everybody looked over, people who didn't have a means to travel or a way to come to him. You know, Jesus was about those people, and the only way he could really effectively do that was to travel, was to go to where they were. So even though people were coming to him, Jesus knew he had to go. People had to see him, see who he was, see what he did. You know, they had to have that, and that's what increased his popularity, which is exactly at this point, what he was trying to do. A large crowd came to him, bringing lame, crippled, blind, mute, many others. They laid him down at his feet, and he healed them. We don't know how many people Jesus healed, but apparently it was a tremendous amount of people that Jesus healed. All those who came to him, of course, not Gentiles here, right? But then we have an example here on that one that sticks out. He's healing all these people, but yet there's a lesson in this healing, right? This one sticks out. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. And Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself. Why? Why? Because this is going to be a lesson. Put his fingers into his ears. After spitting, he touched his tongue with saliva, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, said to him, Yapha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone. Why? Why did he do that? What was the significance of this guy, the healing of this guy? Deaf, mute, right? Spoke with difficulty. What was the significance, do you think, of these healings, of this healing particularly? Well, it was fulfilling prophecy, for sure. But I think when you see miracles like this where he takes them aside with the people that are close to him, what's the deal about being deaf? What does Jesus accuse him of so many times? He says, you what? You what? Jesus says you don't hear, right? Jesus over and over. He says you don't see and you don't hear. Isn't that what he says? Over and over and over he tells them that. You know, hearing you don't hear and seeing you don't see. Sight in this miracle, particularly hearing miracle, was really important to Jesus, to his disciples, because he was teaching them a lesson, to be open, to be receptive to what was going on. You know, here he touches him, doesn't he? Doesn't always do that. He took him aside, put his fingers into his ears, and put his saliva on his tongue. Interesting, huh? And said, be opened. Look, you notice here he looks towards heaven with a deep sigh. You know, why? Why does he do that? You know, he doesn't have to do that. He does it for those that are around him. It's a lesson. He's saying to look towards God, to hear, to be open, and I think that's impressive. You know, miracles sometimes had lessons. They weren't always just to heal the person that had a problem. Sometimes they had a deeper meaning, deeper lessons in them. And this is one of those cases. The mute speaking, the crippled restored, the lame walking, the blind seeing, which is exactly what he told John. And they glorified the God of Israel. They were utterly astonished. He has done all things well. Even he makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So his popularity, of course, is exploding. Nothing he can't do. Nobody he can't heal. You know, there's one thing that Jesus never healed, one type of person that Jesus never healed, and it's always kind of bothered me a little bit, to be honest. Or as far as we know, he never did. He never healed a mentally retarded person in the Bible. Did you ever notice that? Mentally ill. I always thought that was kind of fascinating. Myself. It's just something I've always wondered at, thought about. You know, Jesus healed a lot of these physical ailments, right? But maybe, right. But you know, it's kind of interesting to me, and maybe those people are more ostracized in the society. I mean, I don't really know. or maybe nobody even brought one to him and said, but it's always been a question in my mind, I guess. Wouldn't that have been a miracle to behold, right? To cure somebody who was mentally disabled. Right. Could have been, yeah. 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 Yeah, I've always thought this kind of interesting. Crazy, maybe demon possessed could have been part of that. That could have been part of that. Absolutely. People they said had a demon that could have been mentally disabled, epileptic. Right. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. There's things there that could have been. You know, because like I said, they didn't look at things how we look at things. They didn't look at somebody maybe as being mentally disabled, demon possessed, like Buck says, possible, like you say, possible. Exactly what that could have been. Like I said, Jesus never argues the science ever. He never says, well, this person really isn't demon possessed. This person has epilepsy. He just says, be healed. What difference is it why you think? It makes no difference to me why you think. Pretty doubtful. I mean, Jews wouldn't associate with Gentiles, and Jews ostracized Gentiles. So, for Gentiles to be in a Jewish crowd it would have been bad for the most part. Um, it wouldn't have ended well. Um, they were pretty prejudiced against the Gentiles, the Greeks, Gentiles, Romans. They could have been there, maybe at the rear of a crowd, off to a distance, but in the midst of Jews, no, I don't think they would have dared. I don't think they would have ever done that. Huh? Well, probably mannerisms, dress. A lot of them probably knew each other. Um, I'm sure there was a lot of things they knew that we don't, but I'm sure. And maybe sometimes that would have been hard to do, but I think there definitely was different ethnicity there. Semitics, the Semitics, Abraham's descendants, opposed to, Philistines were definitely a different culture of people. Canaanites. Um, I'm sure there were differences, just like there's differences today that they knew. But yeah, I think for a Gentile to be in a large Jewish crowd that probably would have ended really bad. I think. Do what now? Right. Yeah, there's ways, yeah, things they do. If you ever been, I don't know how it was in the time of Jesus, but if you ever run around any Orthodox Jews, even in the United States, they're pretty evident. I mean, they're Jewish, so by the way they dress. Right. Right. I think if you read, which I would probably not recommend you read it because I promise you it's like reading the dust out in the parking lot. But if you ever read Josephus or Outershine, The Temple, those are two really good books on first century Judaism. And it's kind of interesting, I think, even though we talk a lot about Josephus mentioning Christ, compared to the volume of his writings, Christ is very, very little, 0.5%, right? So even though Jesus was noted by Jews, a lot of Jews didn't recognize him whatsoever. So kind of interesting, I think. Uh, Tyre and Sidon, so which is oh, um, Tyre and Sidon is more up. It's Well, it's north of Jerusalem, so It's more up more in a Gentile, a little more of a Gentile area, but right, but still predominantly Jewish, but a little more Gentile region. Well, he went to a lot of towns and villages. I mean, he didn't travel a long ways away, but I mean, yeah, I mean, he was there going through those villages. There were a lot of Jewish influence all around there. Synagogues, you can see that from Acts. There were synagogues everywhere. There was Jewish influence in all those towns. So even though you might say, well, that was a little more of a Gentile region or Samaritan region, there was still a large Jewish population. So, it existed. Even if you look later on at Acts 13, when Paul was in Antioch, there was a large percentage of Jews in Antioch, and Antioch was really the first Gentile church was Antioch, and there was still a large percentage of Jews up there. So there was a lot of Jewish influence. Up until the destruction of the temple in 71 AD, Jewish influence in the church was really, really big. After the destruction of the temple, the Jews lost a lot of their notoriety and a lot of their power, for sure. So things kind of changed a little bit after that. I feel compassion. Once again, the feeding of the many. 3 days with nothing to eat. They might faint on the way. 3 days. That's quite a while, isn't it? If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come a great distance. So we talk about day fast. Well, this is 3 days with no food because Jesus is there and they won't leave. So he's afraid they'll faint on the way home if he doesn't provide them some sustenance. And the disciples said, where will we go? Once again, this question, right? How many loaves? 7. A few small fish. Feeding of the many with the little. Sat down, broke them. Once again, blessed them as he always did. Giving thanks, he broke them, giving them to the disciples, gave them to the people. They were satisfied. 7 large baskets full. Interesting, 7. We talked about biblical numerology, right? 7 baskets, perfect number, right? Completeness. That Jesus not only provided, but there was an abundance, provided more than what they could eat. And it says there were 4,000 men besides women and children. So there could have been 10,000, 12,000 people there. Pretty easy. So that's a lot of food, isn't it? These miracles just keep coming, don't they? Whether it's calming storms, healing sickness, feeding the multitude, miracles after miracles after miracles after miracles. They just keep coming from Jesus all the time. And of course, his notoriety keeps going up. He goes to the region of Magadan, the district of Damanthus. So once again, by the Sea of Galilee, he's traveling to another region. Like Sherry says, were all these Jewish? There was Jewish influence in all of them. No, some of them were a little more. When he went to the Gadarenes, to Legion, right, Gennesaret, that was predominantly Greek. That region was predominant. That's one reason he got criticized for going there. Why do you want to go? Because he just went basically for that one, for Legion. But why do you go there? Because that was predominantly Gentile, predominantly Greek region there. So was he around the Gentiles? Yes. Was he? But he was sent to the Jews. And like I said, there was a great Jewish influence throughout all that region. So he had that ability. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came. Sects of the Jews. These no longer exist. We know that, right? We wish we knew more about them. But the truth is, mostly what we know about Pharisees and Sadducees are from the Bible. There's just not a lot of historical basis. A little bit from Josephus, once again, not much. We don't know much about these sects of Jews. We know at the time of Christ, there were 4 main Jewish sects. We know that. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. Those were the 4 big sects of Judaism at the time of Christ. The Zealots were who wanted to overthrow Rome. They wanted to kick Rome out of Jerusalem. They were military. They were very militant. They wanted to raise up and physically, by force, by violence, they wanted to revolt and to throw the Roman Empire out of Judea. They would eventually cause the fall or destruction of Jerusalem in 71 AD, because they would eventually rise up to fight the Romans. The Romans would send Titus to, my brain's trying to think of who was the emperor before Titus. Anyway, it's not coming to me. See his face, can't tell you his name. Anyway, sends Titus to Jerusalem to siege Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would fall, the temple would be destroyed, Jews would die, maybe 1 million Jews would die, unbelievable. Terrible destruction. That was because of the Zealots. That's what eventually would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. The Essenes were nomadic. They were, well, maybe not, that's not the right word. They were monkish. Is that a word, monkish? Maybe not. It's a new word. I just invented it. Monkish. They were like you would consider monks. They were all male. They didn't marry. They increased their number by taking in orphans and children, male children, and bringing them up in their sect. They were a cult, essentially. They lived in the desert. They baptized in sand. They spent all their days studying, copying Scripture. If you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1948, that contained books of the Old Law. Are you all familiar with Dead Sea Scrolls? Y'all have heard of Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls were copied and buried by the Essenes. They're who actually buried those in the desert that we recovered. That was by the Essenes, the sect of the Jews, the Essenes. They're the ones who actually copied those scrolls and put them in the pots and buried them. And they were actually by the Dead Sea, and they were discovered by archaeologists, and they dug them up. Very important archaeologically, biblical discovery, huge biblical discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls. That's because of the Essenes. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are the two main sects that we hear about in the Bible. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were very different. The Sadducees didn't believe in angels or the resurrection. I used to think that meant they just didn't believe in the bodily resurrection. But I've kind of come to the conclusion, because of modern Judaism, that they didn't believe in the eternal state of the soul, which seems kind of odd, but they didn't. They believed that everything about God was in this life, in this earth. So what did that mean? It meant that everything that was around them, whether it be their wealth, their health, their prosperity, their sickness, their disease, or their poverty, came from God. And it meant that God was a rewarder in this life, not the next life, of how you lived. So if you were sick, it was because you sinned. If you were if you were blind, it was because somebody messed up. If you were in poverty, it was because God was cursing you for some reason. If you were doing everything God wanted you to do and living your perfect life, then you would be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous in the eyes of a Sadducee. Does that make any sense? So it really influenced Judaism and how they looked at possessions and how they looked at things they had, and their health, even their health, become a product not of science, but became a product of God's curse or God's blessing upon your life. The Pharisees and they only took the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, to be, they didn't take the prophets, just the Pentateuch, to be their basis, the law. So you got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They took those books to be their law. Whereas the Pharisees took everything, took oral tradition, the oral tradition, took the all prophets, took the poetry books. They took everything. They believed in the resurrection. They believed in angels. They believed in demons. They believed in all of those things we know pretty much because of the arguments Paul had. And so they were a lot more what we would consider the liberal side. The Sadducees were more the conservative side, if you wanted to look at it that way. The high priest, Annas and Caiaphas, were Sadducees, okay? And there were Sadducees and Pharisees on the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish court, the 70 seats of the Jewish court. That's the Sanhedrin. There were Pharisees and Sadducees on the Sanhedrin. And Paul used that to his advantage because he said, I'm on trial today because of the resurrection. Well, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Pharisees did believe in the resurrection. So they started fighting against themselves and forgot all about Paul being there. So Paul used that to his benefit. So when we start talking in the Bible, predominantly Jesus talks to Pharisees and Sadducees. Now there's two other groups of people that are mentioned in the Gospels. And those are the scribes, right? And the scribes are the ones who copied the Bible, copied it over and over and over and over. They're the ones who copied all the scrolls, who copied the law and made copies of things. So they were very, very knowledgeable because they did it over and over and over again. So if you wanted to know something the law said or the Old Testament said, you ask a scribe, because those guys copied it over and over and over and over. They knew it. They knew where it was. When the wise men came to Herod the Great at the birth of Jesus and said, where is Jesus going to be born? It was the scribes who said Bethlehem, because they knew that from the book of Micah, because they didn't have ways to look at things like we do now. They just had to do it from memory. So they knew that. And the other group of people we hear is the elders. Which were the elders? Those in the synagogue that were the elderly members that knew, and they were highly respected and highly valued at the time of Jesus. So those are the groups of Jesus that we see that he surrounds himself with. And so, once again, it's these Pharisees and Sadducees that argue with him, seeking a sign from heaven. And Jesus said, when it is evening, you say in Matthew, Mark doesn't give us this part, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the time? Jesus says, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given. So they want a sign. What's the difference in a sign and a miracle? They saw a ton of miracles. Jesus doing miracles every single day, every day. What do they want? They don't want a miracle. So what are they looking for? What do they want to see? What's the sign? Right. They want to see something that says, I'm the Messiah. I'm the Christ. They want him to give them that sign that's going to say, I'm the Messiah. Right? They want to see a big thing, a sign, not a miracle. They want to see a sign, something that says, I'm the Messiah. So there were signs, but they weren't paying attention. What were the signs? Go back to the very first sign, right? John the Baptist, right? Malachi says Elijah will come before that day of the Lord. Jesus said John the Baptist was that Elijah who was to come, right? He was a sign. John the Baptist was a sign that this was the Messiah, right? The manger in Bethlehem, the birth, that was a sign, right? That was prophetic, right? That was a sign that you're the Messiah, that you're the Son of God, right? Isaiah 53, those were all signs. They weren't looking. They wanted the sign they wanted to see, Jesus being king. That's what they wanted. That's what they wanted. They wanted Jesus to rise up and be the king, be that king that's going to restore Israel. They wanted the sign. And Jesus says, no sign will be given to this generation, which is true and false, right? The sign they're looking for will not be given to them. The signs that Jesus the Messiah are all around them. They're just not paying attention. The sign of Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Right? That's the sign he says they'll be given. That he'll be different place, but same question. Right? We're about out of time. We'll probably stop here. All right, thanks for your time this morning.